In this country, we believe that there should be freedom for all, even though not all of us believe in it. Join Tom and Chase as they explore politics, economics, and everything else that threatens your individual liberty. This is the Free For All Podcast.
All right, welcome back, guys. Free For All episode 19.
Welcome back to another episode of the Free For All Podcast, guys. As always, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate all of you who continue to support us and listen to the show. Please remember to follow us on our socials, Twitter at FFA Podcast 1776 and Instagram at Free For All Podcast. Our show is available wherever you listen to your podcasts, whether that's Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, or Apple Podcasts. On this episode, we have a few topics to discuss, the main one being the recent respark of the conflict in Gaza. It's important to remember that there really isn't a right or wrong in this conflict, as the conflict itself and its history date back thousands of years. In this episode, we wanted to explore the conflict as it is today, as well as the historical causes and the issues that it presents in present day, as well as a couple other topics. So just getting into topic number one, the Gaza conflict. Obviously, the last 2 weeks, we've kind of seen the return of the Gaza conflict to the spotlight. Airstrikes by Hamas on Israel and vice versa, with Israel on Palestine and Hamas. To understand that conflict in present day, you really need to understand the historical reasoning behind the conflict itself, which I feel like a lot of people don't get, and that's why they kind of just blindly support one side or another. So first and foremost, the biggest reason why Palestine and Israel continue to fight is that both Judaism and Islam both lay claim to Jerusalem as Holy Land. Palestine essentially believes that Israel is occupying Islamic Holy Land, and Israel believes the same thing just from the Jewish perspective. This fight between the two religions has existed for literally thousands of years. Both the existence of Islam and Judaism have kind of put both of those religions at conflict, in which they occupy the same areas of land. In short, both religions believe that Jerusalem is Holy Land to their religion, and Israel's, persecution of the Palestinian Muslims that live in Jerusalem has only worsened the conflict over the years.
Yeah, and there's an author named Sheldon Richman, and I've heard him in a lot of interviews and podcasts and stuff. And he writes a book. It's basically a collection of essays, and he has this book called Coming to Palestine, which talks about a lot of the history of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. And I highly recommend that you read his books or listen to any of his interviews. And, you can just search it up YouTube or whatever. So we talk about this land having religious and historical meaning. Both groups have a long history in the area. And like you said, obviously we've heard that Jews have been here for thousands of years. They're in the Bible and all that. And they have birthright to a certain patch of land. But the argument is kind of nonsense, because if you've ever really heard the term Philistines in the Bible, it's tossed around a lot. And you should know that there have been references to Palestine in their historical fights with the Israelites, even centuries before the birth of Christ. And because of all this, there's bad blood, and it's so old and it's so ingrained in their cultures. And having lost a lot of the Middle East to the Ottomans, the Jews were probably out of the area mainly for mostly 1,000 years, just scattered across Europe and all these other places. And but after Britain defeated the Ottomans in World War I, they declared Palestine a place for the Jews and Muslims and even Christians, basically to coexist in this Holy Land. And this was in 1917. But both groups basically failed to coexist, and that's why since 1948, it only lasted like 30 years, and it was going crazy the whole time. Since 1948, we've had this two-state solution, which is what they call, separating the land into Israel and Palestine. But it pretty much didn't really end there, because, first of all, when they're creating these two countries, you're obviously going to be displacing people. So over 700,000 Palestinians were basically uprooted and forced out of their homes and pushed out of the new state of Israel. And this wasn't just Muslims, but there are a decent amount of Christians in here too. I'm sure some secularists. And that's what Sheldon Richman says. But going further on, if you look on the internet, you can find all these maps, chronological maps going through time of Israel and Palestine between 1948 and today, and you can see how it's changed. And Palestine was basically 75% of this landmass in 1948, and both Israel and Palestine were somewhat sizable and had borders with other countries. And also the proportion of land per each religious group was a little bit more comparable to their population and whatnot, because it's mostly Muslims in that area. But today, you can see with these maps, Palestine exists basically like an island within the state of Israel. They're completely landlocked. And it's actually multiple little islands. It's like Pepper or whatever, if you look at a map. And there's many, many people who consider themselves Palestinian whose land has now become part of Israel just through all these legalities and all this other garbage, some of these wars and stuff. And these people are pretty much not given a lot of rights in Israel. They're not given voting rights, for example. And I'm not really too in depth with the rest of the history besides a lot of what I just said, but that boils down to the big conflicts and the big, basically what's been going on with this land for the 20th and 21st century. And it seems like Israel just keeps using this birthright and terrorism argument against Palestine, blaming Hamas for a bunch of stuff, to spawn international pressure to legally dwindle away Palestine instead of the classic way of actually taking over a country or a land, which is conquest, in which, you're fighting, and obviously neither side really looks right, but there's a definite victor in the end. But now we have Israel just kind of doing this legal takeover of Palestine, and there's still this huge debate about who's right or who's actually got this land. And, they're trying to use this international kind of pressure to get this land. And this was really exhibited when Trump unilaterally granted the Golan Heights to Israel a year or two ago. And I think they put like a Trump Heights sign on it or something. And just as a bystander, it just appears to me, like I said, I don't know all the information, but it just appears to me like they're using every tactic to make themselves look good and not boil it down to what it truly is, which is just a long-standing religious war for the Holy Land.
And so Gaza then comes into play for a very specific reason. Gaza, which is commonly known as the Gaza Strip, is an area of land that basically borders Israel, but is an autonomously controlled region of Palestine. And so for this very reason, it's a perfect area for war to be waged between the Palestinian terrorist group Hamas and the Israeli Defense Force, or the IDF. The land is not Israeli, nor is it part of the Palestinian homeland, and for that very reason, it historically has been destroyed and rebuilt numerous times due to the sheer amount of destruction and damage done by either party through airstrikes, mortar fire, explosives, and other means of destruction. And so now that you understand a little bit of the history behind the conflict, you can better understand what's happening now. And obviously, with my education and the fact that I studied international conflict, terrorism, torture, state-governed violence, and stuff like that in college, the biggest problem that I personally see with this conflict is that both sides believe wholeheartedly that their side is the only just side, and they will do anything to see their cause achieved. Both sides are constantly trying to get the upper hand on the other through any means necessary. And much of this is achieved through special operations, specifically on the side of Israel. And obviously, many countries do this. In fact, Israel actually really learned this from the United States, considering how much the U.S. has done this, especially in like the regions of South America and even in the Middle East in the past. But using special ops of the military to try and gain intelligence or even destabilize the enemy is one of the biggest reasons this conflict continues, because Israel can conduct these operations as much as they want, but they know that in the event they screw up, Big Brother United States will just come and back them up, as we have done numerous times throughout history.
But yeah, and that's very true. And there's a couple big examples in history. And the U.S. has backed Israel up even when Israel has attacked the U.S. And if nobody's heard that before, you heard me right. Israel has attacked the U.S. Back in 1967. They attacked the USS Liberty. They killed 34 U.S. servicemen and wounded 174 more. And then afterwards, the U.S. government and the Israeli government both claimed it was an accident. But there were payouts to all the soldiers' families and all that stuff. And reports by the sailors claim that Israel was well aware of whose ship it was and even made multiple flyovers. And the sailors could see that they were IDF aircraft. So, if they can see what aircraft it is, I'm sure the IDF knows exactly whose ship it was. And they were also in international waters, by the way. And then in another instance, which is way worse, of Israel betraying the United States, there is the Levant affair. Excuse me. Israel basically plotted a false flag attack against the U.S. and Britain. That is, they hired people to act like their enemies to bomb the U.S. and British civilian targets. The whole reason why they did this is because the U.S. and Britain were losing interest in the area, and particularly the Suez Canal, which the British were controlling for the most part of the 20th century. And Israel didn't want Egypt to fill the power vacuum and ultimately control the Suez Canal and become the voice to reckon with in the Middle East. So a bunch of people were charged in Egyptian court and basically either killed themselves or were executed for committing these false flag attacks against the U.S. and Britain. But of course, we'll never know the true details, and all this has pretty much been buried through history.
And so then what it comes down to is the U.S. has basically become Israel's smoking gun in a sense, considering they come crying to us for aid pretty much every single time that they're attacked. They know that if they come to us and ask for the aid, that they're going to get it.
Well, yeah, and they're supposed to be our number one ally, even though they've only really they haven't done a lot right for. I mean, what do they give us? We give them foreign aid every year, and it seems like they've only done wrongs to us and acted like the kid who gets in trouble and needs to be picked up from school and needs to be bailed out or whatever.
Yeah, and so another big issue that arises from this is the fact that many Americans can't bring themselves to blame Israel for their share in fueling the conflict. Whether this is because they're uneducated or just simply ignorant remains to be seen. But some of it may even be because Hamas is simply seen as a terrorist group and they're just dehumanized because of it. Nobody thinks about what they're actually fighting for. Some may just assume that because they are by and large a terrorist organization, that they have no valid grievances, and as such, Israel is the only correct party in the conflict. But because of U.S. support, both from the government and many of the U.S.'s citizens, Israel simply believes it can meddle in the business of other countries, and then when they're attacked for it, simply claim it is not their fault. That they got attacked, and then receive aid when things get bad. And at the same time, Hamas also fuels the fire. I'm not scapegoating them at all. Hamas also fuels the fire because they utilize child soldiers in battle. They place women and children in the line of fire to deter Israel from using artillery strikes on them. And this is a tactic that many terrorist organizations use. It's not just unique to Hamas as an organization. Many of these terrorist organizations, being smaller in number, utilize guerrilla tactics basically to wage war, which are essentially sneak surprise attacks in very small numbers, and then basically just receding to regroup and then launch another attack once that one is snuffed out. Israel is not really adept at this sort of style of conflict because they've always pretty much taken enemies head on. And therefore, that's why we see mass numbers of civilian casualties. If you're not adept at a certain fighting style like that, then you're going to make mistakes.
Yeah, and that's kind of like, Hamas they call it terrorism, what Hamas is doing, and then they call it special ops, what Israel's doing. I don't know if they're attacking civilian targets or whatever, but they're, doing that kind of, just like you said, guerrilla warfare of sending a few people in and trying to get the biggest effect possible and then just getting out of there. But I'm not just shitting on Israel either. I don't think Hamas is a great thing. In fact, I don't like Islamic values at all, especially Sunnis. But the mudslinging against Hamas is just so plentiful, and you always see it every time something like this pops up in the news. And it just kind of goes without saying that they do some bad stuff because you hear it so much. And of course, neither side is correct, and this isn't a black and white issue. Both sides do absolutely heinous things at times. But when a conflict heats up when a conflict heats up again over there, there's always the typical people defending one side or other. You have the edgy liberals and the Muslims saying that Israel murders women and children, which is a half truth. And then you have the mainstream media and almost every politician in the U.S. and almost all Christians and Jews defending Israel no matter what, and parroting Hamas as a terrorist group, which is also true, but also conveniently omits information. In fact, if you take terrorism by definition, which is, quote, the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims, it seems like things like the Lavon affair would qualify as terrorism. But that's way too much information and way too much for some people to hear, because it would just make them question their worldview, their values, and their understanding of history. People are so infatuated with these dichotomies of, either one side's great, one side's sucks, that they need to subscribe to this groupthink. And that's all a two-party system is, basically. And this mentality spills over into their, like I said, their worldview, values, and their understanding of history. So it's this dichotomy in foreign policy, and it's also this dichotomy in politics here. And, it's always, like, you go back to history, it's always the Union were the good guys in Civil War, the Allies were the good guys in World War II, etc., which kind of completely bastardizes history and ignores all the heinous things that might have been committed by the good guys, quote unquote. But I mean, how about just recognizing what happened and having an objective view of history? It's just these people won, like this is what the law is now or whatever. That's just too hard because the victors write the history books. Like I said, it's very hard to find that these days. And I grew up watching the military channel, history channel, etc., and all this World War II, Civil War, all this other stuff. And never once did I question the integrity of the U.S. in a conflict. I always thought that they were the good guys, like, you're bringing freedom to everybody, etc. And that's the whole Fox News agenda, at least into the mid-2000s. And then you go on to learn about the true motives of these wars, which almost always get leaked in retrospect. And it's always a lie. Just look at the Pentagon Papers. We got lied into Vietnam. Look at the supposed WMDs in Iraq that were never there. Look at the falsified reports of sarin gas attacks in Syria, which caused Trump to bomb a Russian base. Look at all the times the U.S. has blown up its own ships in order to convince its citizens to go to war. It's happened 3 or 4 times. So just get your ass off Google and start actually curating information. You'll find the stuff pretty easily. There's some very questionable shit that everybody does.
Yeah, and so obviously, for me personally, as somebody who's studied these world conflicts throughout my college career, especially in the case of terrorism and armed conflict, the only real route to peace that I could see occurring is Jerusalem being removed as an Israeli city in exchange for it being autonomously governed by some sort of third party with like a coalition government, or giving equal ownership of the city to both Palestine and Israel. The reason the conflict obviously persists is because one side has full control of the city and the other one has none. If both sides will always believe that they're right, there simply is not going to be a resolution without some sort of third-party mediation between both of the countries.
Yeah, and I don't even know if that would necessarily solve it, because it might become like a East-West Germany situation. I just think like with these religions, these people are so far removed from their thoughts as an individual that they want to subscribe to these big groups, like these big organized religions, and then they become part of these wars that really have nothing to do with them. So if they all just stopped caring, that would be better. But obviously they're not going to do that. So maybe what you're saying might have to happen.
Yeah, and see, that's the biggest issue with diplomacy, is it's all hypothetical. There's never really a set and true way of going about things. It's always, you have to take into account all of the different factors in the situation and figure out something that works out best for both parties in the situation, especially when you have a conflict that's been this embroiled in history, for the last thousands of years. There's really no decent way to go about anything that's going to completely and utterly avoid conflict. Like, obviously, my solution is probably is what I see the easiest way to peace or whatever. That's the easiest route that I see, but at the same time, it's not without its flaws, and it's not going to be without conflict. Obviously, as this continues, more and more different external factors will make themselves known, and it'll become even dicier, which is why this conflict needs to be taken care of very soon, or else it will end up boiling over into an all-out war.
Yeah, especially when we have all these alliances and, we call them proxy wars, when you fund a country and they're going to war with somebody else basically on your behalf.
Yeah, and see, I wouldn't get into that issue right now, because I definitely could go into that, because that's an underlying cause of World War I that nobody seems to understand either. But that's a topic for a different episode, because that's like a rabbit hole that I don't want to go down right now.
Yeah, exactly. But it's the same thing over and over again. We see history repeating itself, and it's just happening right now. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is more of a rant than anything. I've just been getting kind of pissed off this past week, seeing, there's a lot going on with, the news about Fauci funding the Wuhan lab where COVID-19 originated. Apparently, there are white papers, which are official government documents, that link him to a scientist at the Wuhan Institute who was studying the coronavirus strains. Apparently, in these white papers, there's even transaction IDs, and this basically confirms that the money was sent from Fauci's National Institute of Health to fund research there. And Rand Paul was one of the first to go after him. So Fauci originally stated that there was no possible connection, that the virus appeared in nature. And, now with all this coming out, he's been forced to acknowledge at least the possibility that it was created in a lab. But even worse, Rand Paul is contending now that the research done in Wuhan was, quote, gain of function research, which means it intends to research how to make a virus more contagious or deadly, which would explain a lot about why this is like such an unheard of virus kind of thing. And just remember, Rand Paul's a doctor as well, so he's not just shooting the shit. He's not just throwing this out there. He hasn't made a failure out of his career like Dr. Fauci, who made a big failure of the AIDS epidemic back in the day.
Yeah, and I mentioned this in our very, very first episode that we ever did, which actually happened to be on the issue of COVID. I had the virus and almost died from it last year. I was in the ICU for 2 weeks. While we know that this obviously wasn't the case for 99.9% of people who got this virus, the way the virus is very contagious and has the ability to shut down systems in your body in a systematic fashion has always led me to the belief that this was some sort of genetically engineered bioweapon that China was working on that got out on accident. After all, they did lie to us about case numbers and didn't even tell us the virus had even escaped the lab for almost 2 to 3 months after it had happened. And so there really was no motive for them to do something like that if it wasn't something that they were trying to control within their homeland without alerting anybody else. Because if they were to have told us from the very beginning, people would have started asking questions a lot sooner. It would have been hard for them to deal with. And so like I just said, basically, I've always believed that it was a genetically engineered bioweapon that China was working on that got out on accident. And there's way too many factors to account for. And the virus behaves unlike any naturally occurring viruses that we've already dealt with. And so it seems that my theory may have just been proven correct after all, which is hilarious to think about, because I got clowned for that big time.
Yeah, and people won't even debate you. They'll just put a clown emoji. But, you're talking about, it could be a bioweapon from China, but with all this thing of like Fauci potentially funding them, like, is it a bioweapon funded by the U.S. Still? So I don't know where the motive lies necessarily, but it seems like at least it was a testing grounds for all the shutdowns and stuff like that to see if stuff would work. But that's just my mind going off. So all this stuff's coming out, and there's also another wave of, quote, anti-vaxxers on the right because of all this failed animal testing. And please check out our last episode if you don't know about that. But the other thing now, too, is people more and more openly defying the social distancing and mask mandates, and even seeing whole states removing that. I know in Orlando here, most businesses I go into now have some people with and some people without masks, and businesses aren't really enforcing it as much. But this is all great, right? Everybody is going back to normal. People are waking up, but I don't know. I just want to say, like, where the fuck were all these people last year? All these conservatives, they call themselves. When I was saying this was a government shutdown and this is all unnecessary, I was saying this since day one. Where were all these right-wingers saying not to take the vax when Trump was the one rushing it through the trials? They're saying, oh, these liberals are saying don't take the vax, but that's just bad against Trump. It's easy for them to claim all this stuff is messed up in retrospect. It's like all the Republicans in 2016 were like, oh yeah, of course I wouldn't go into Iraq now. It's like, yeah, it's easy to claim that in retrospect. Hindsight's 2020. But I was claiming last March, at the beginning, that these measures would do more harm than good. That Trump's economic impact payments, like he calls them, literally UBI, should have just voted in Andrew Yang, where I was claiming this was kicking the inflation can down the road. Nobody else cared about that. Nobody was yelling, fire Fauci, louder than me. I pointed out his hypocrisy since January last year. I pointed out his original flip-flop on the usage of masks, and all that should have been enough to discredit him. Him getting caught in public without a mask should have been enough to discredit him. But no, Trump left him there, and people let Fauci basically become the president. A lot of Republicans really, really respected this guy. Then came the shutdowns. Another thing that mainstream conservatives hated only in retrospect. They weren't actively defying it. Only some gym openers stayed open. Only some salons. These ladies cutting hair have more balls than most of you conservatives. Is that sad? Nearly everyone in this country last March and April was scared shitless. They're told there's a pandemic. They call it a pandemic. That's programming in itself. It was never a pandemic. The prefix pan means all. I would love for the world's biggest experts in disease to explain to me how a 0.3% chance of dying somehow affects all humans in the world. Please take a statistics class. It's literally insignificant. But it doesn't even matter. Programming fucking worked. Republicans gave up their rights to their local governments because of a scary little cough that they didn't even know how deadly it was. But where's their principle? Where's their principle? It's seriously concerning. I'm one of those people that believes the devil you do know is worse than the devil you don't. I was saying from day one, I would rather avoid the economic consequences of the virus than the virus itself. You don't know how bad the virus is. You don't know how deadly it is, but you do know how deadly it can be to put somebody out of work and let them starve to death. But I'm such an asshole because I say that. I'm basically saying, grandma must die so we can maintain the GDP. I'm such a douchebag free marketer, right? Seriously, everyone was so obsessed seeing the COVID numbers on cable news tick up and up. They didn't care what the consequences were. They just wanted to sit home, collect their Trump check. But I'll bring this all back to my point. Like, they now flip on all this all of a sudden. Now Biden's in office, so it's not good. Now they say inflation is an issue. Now they say the vaccine's suspicious after all this is coming out. Not when all the companies were pushing it on us when it seemed suspicious in the first place, like a drug dealer trying to sell you drugs. Seriously. Now they say masks are stupid by and large on the grounds that a lot of people are already vaccinated. Come on, man. Where does the principle lie? I don't think conservatives really believe in anything anymore. They just watch Fox News, or they just want to get pissed off and act like they're the opposite of whatever the Democrats are saying in that day. They don't conserve anything. They're just a 10-year lagging version of the Democrat Party. And I stand by that more and more every day. Like, I prove myself right more and more. Like, I don't know why I ever doubt myself. I don't trust anybody who tells me what I should do or what is good for me, especially when it's the government officials and they don't even abide by their own rules. Like, they don't have the mask on when they're off camera. They're going in to get their hair cut when they're shutting everything else down. Fuck them. Fuck Fauci. I hope all these people go to Gitmo. They fucked more people's lives than probably a lot of terrorists. And, just remind yourself, the vaccine is experimental medicine. And Tom's almost always right.
And it's funny too, because what you just said is literally the exact point that Eric July always makes, is that conservatives are outdated and they're pretty much always a step behind. They do damage control rather than preventing the problem from occurring in the first place. And what in the hell is the point of denouncing Fauci and all these tyrannical problems if you're a year too late to begin with? It's completely retarded. So yeah, I would 100% agree. They're way too late in denouncing everything, and now instead of having prevented this problem from occurring in the first place, they're now just doing damage control, and they're saying, oh, look at all of this stuff that happened or whatever. Look, like, Fauci was wrong and everything. Like, dude, we've been saying that from the very beginning, but you guys just went along with it because Trump had originally selected him.
Oh yeah.
It comes back to Orange Man Jesus and their blind obedience to him.
Well, yeah, and they're doing damage control. Like I was saying, Trump basically brought in this UBI. I said from the get-go, there's this saying, there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government policy. Now we see Biden, obviously doing a couple more checks, but now he's doing the $300 a month for people who have kids under 6 or something like that. And
oh yeah,
it's just like,
I heard about that.
It's just like damage control, but the precedent has already been set. Like, conservatives are fighting this thing, but there's already, you're fighting the vaccine. There's already been 100 million people vaccinated in the U.S. Like, you're fighting inflation and UBI. Like, it's already here to stay. You're fighting Fauci. It's like, sorry, Trump already kept Fauci from previous administrations, allowed Fauci to do his damage, and then allowed Biden to keep Fauci in there. It's just like, come on. They're not getting anywhere.
Yeah, it's just backpedaling.
Yeah. So don't subscribe to what the mainstream media is saying. Like, don't fit into this box of like left or right, like on this issue of Israel or this issue of the crazy cough. It's just both stupid.
I think the biggest takeaway that I would give everybody from this episode is please think for yourself. Please do your research. Please don't listen to everything that you see online, because odds are it's either incorrect or severely misinformed. There are, obviously, with the Gaza conflict, there's lots to take away from that. And there's lots of stuff that many people are completely unaware of in terms of the history of that conflict. And that's why we see so many people just parroting Israel's agenda with absolutely no real thought into anything. But then also, with the COVID vaccine and the whole issue of just COVID in general, as we've said, and we've talked about it on the show multiple times now, you can easily do the same thing with that as well and just parrot the mainstream media's agenda and not really look for anything yourself. We've been talking about this since the very beginning of our show, and we will continue to talk about it until the problem goes away. But issues like this are not going to go away until we wake more people up. And so that's what we're trying to do with this show, is get more people to understand what we're talking about.
Yeah. Every day, more and more people are putting their foot down and saying never again. I mean, I talk about it being bad that these people are just waking up now, but at least they are waking up. And I really appreciate that. And we appreciate everybody that listens to the show. So thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you guys again for tuning into the episode. I think that's all we have for you guys this week. Like I said before, we're trying to put out content for you guys, and obviously this last week we didn't really have much of anything for you, but we did have this episode. Hopefully we'll have another episode for you guys next week. Obviously, if not, you can check with us on our socials, and we'll keep you guys up to date on those as well. But thank you guys for listening. We appreciate you guys tuning in. And until next week, peace. Have a good one.
Thanks, guys. Have a great one.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Free For All podcast. You can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Make sure to follow and subscribe to the show and connect with us on Instagram to keep up to date with all the latest content. Peace.